Hello and welcome to a special UFOcast review of some Stingray merchandise, specifically the two novels, The Titanic and Stratagem and Project Orca, forming part of the Deadly Uprising saga. And part of the reason that I'm reviewing these now is because Michael very kindly passed on his review copies of the audiobooks of those stories, but also because Anderson Entertainment have just, as I record this today, made it cheaper for you to experience the whole saga. So for those who don't know, Deadly Uprising comprises a series of 8 what they call Marine Minutes, which are short YouTube videos that are taking footage from Stingray and then new dialogue recorded by Mark Silk and Nick Briggs and Wayne Forrester, the cast of the Stingray audio adventures. So those have always been free and remain free on the Anderson YouTube channel. And then the rest is comprised of the 2 novels that I'm going to talk about today and some series of comic strips that go in between the novels, and then sort of kicking stuff off a live performance at the Stand By for Action Tunes of Danger concert from last year. And up till now, the only way of experiencing that was to buy the DVD or Blu-ray of the concert, or to have been to the concert. And the comic strips were part of larger comic collections, so a whole bunch of comics collected from the 60s, and then the new comics. And all that was quite expensive, particularly if you wanted to buy the hardback versions of the books, and particularly if you wanted to buy the Blu-ray when it came out. The bit from the concert is now on the Jerry Anderson YouTube channel, so if you didn't make it to the concert and you haven't got the Blu-ray, you can get that for free, so that's part of it. And they've just announced that they're releasing the comics from Deadly Uprising separately as a £20 volume, which I'm going to pick up, I think, because it's the only bit of the saga I now don't have. So if cost was a barrier, which for me it initially was, that has now been largely removed from the equation, because you can also get the books that I'm going to talk about today for $3.99 as Kindle editions. If you want the hardbacks or if you want the audiobooks, you're going to have to shell out a bit more, I'm afraid. But you can experience those 2 stories for £4 each. So a much more accessible saga. And I think, and this is me having not read the comic book bit yet, which I'm really keen to do now, I think that makes the whole thing worth it. So let's talk about the 2 novels. So The Titanic and Stratagem follows on from the opening Marine Minute and then the performance at the concert, which definitely erred on the comical side of things, in that Titan was allying himself with a particular race called the Harmonians, I think, who had this musical weapon. So it kind of fitted into the whole idea of doing a concert. Let me just say again, it was a travesty that they did a concert called Tunes of Danger and didn't have any music from the episode Tune of Danger, okay? I've said it before, I will keep saying it. Anyway, that aside, the content is great. I do now have the Blu-ray. I'm looking forward to watching that. I've been listening to it on Spotify for quite some time now, well, since it came out, as I did with the concert from the previous, 2 years, I think it was, the previous one. So the Titanic and Stratagem is the first sort of big part of this ongoing saga, where Titan goes, let's make an alliance of the undersea races. And the story follows on from there. And basically what happened, I think I can probably, the initial setup is that they go, let's steal all of the mission data that Marineville have, and then we're going to be able to look through all those and go, well, here's all the alien races that Troy Tempest has encountered and been an enemy of, and then we can go to them and say, let's have an alliance, and we can take over the land, like as Titan always wants to do, is to defeat the Turanians. So that's the setup. And the alien race, the underwater race that they pick, is the one that built the special hull that couldn't be penetrated by a Sting missile in the episode Nut for Marineville, and they also appear in Hostages from the Deep. And both of those scenarios are referenced throughout this novel. So for a novel that's called The Titanic and Stratagem, there's actually the largest part of it is actually with this other alien race exploring their underwater city. I'm afraid I can't already remember what they're called. Anyway, I loved this novel. I really, really appreciated the storytelling from Chris Dale. So it's a strong story, basically. So on that level, it's an intriguing tale. It's something that is beyond the scope of a 25-minute Stingray episode. there's a lot more depth to it. There's a lot more episodes to it, as it were. I mean, I guess you could have told this story across 3, 4, 5 Stingray episodes if they'd been in that mode, but obviously that isn't the way that Stingray was made back in the day. The character work is spot on. If you know Stingray, and I'm assuming if you're listening to this podcast, you know Stingray, the character work is spot on, particularly the way that he makes you feel sorry for X20. So you get bits of the interaction between Titan and X20 where, X20 is a villain, right? He works for Titan. He's a bad guy. He always has been a bad guy. But equally, you feel sorry for him as a subordinate to Titan. And the novel does very well at playing upon that. It also does very well at taking the perhaps slightly more dodgy aspects of the TV show. For example, how easily it is for X20 to break into Marineville week after week with his disguises, and has a character come in from the outside in Lieutenant Coral and go, this is ridiculous, what are we going to do to tighten up security? Which then plays into the second novel. And it has a really interesting look into the relationship between Titan and the Aquamphibians. I'm not going to say anything more about that, but there's a really interesting story there. And it also takes Titan and puts him in a situation where he is weak. And you see what happens, how he reacts in a different way to Troy. There's a sort of contrast between the two characters. So that's really, really, really interesting. It also brings back the scientist character, whose name I've also forgotten because it's been a few weeks since I listened to these. The scientist who failed Titan when he got the Gorgon to home into Stingray, and then they dropped the device onto Titan's ship, and so the comedy end of there's a swordfish attacking it. That episode, he's back and coming up with schemes, and he has an ongoing role actually in the saga. So he's an interesting character. As I said, they bring in Lieutenant Coral as an outside expert to kind of investigate this break into Marineville. She is added into the story, and she and Atlanta get to play, and Fisher get to play a bigger role in the story beyond the usual crew of Troy, Marina, and Phones. Marina is particularly well served in this story. As you'll know, she's a mute character, so it's interesting how she plays a role in an audiobook. She gets a lot of description, obviously, of what she does. But she is a key member of the crew. Everybody gets to play their part. And Wayne Forrester does a fantastic job with all the voices, particularly the two that he does in the sort of full cast stories where he plays X20 and Phones, as Robert Easton did in the original. But he also does a pretty reasonable Titan and Commander Shaw and all the rest of the characters. So it's an interesting, multifaceted story. And of the 2 novels, this one works better as a standalone. So the idea is that you can dip into any of the parts of the Deadly Uprising. So you can read this novel as a novel and it stands on its own. And you can read Project Orca as a novel and it stands on its own. And I would say that is true to an extent. But I think reading both novels, you come away going, well, I want to experience the rest of the saga, which I guess is kind of the idea. So in that sense, it's worked in kind of sucking me in and going, I want to hear what the rest of the story is. So although the story ends, it sets up the next stage of the story. So on to Book 2, Project Orca. And as I said, this feels less like it stands alone, in part because it begins in the aftermath of a previous adventure of some kind, which presumably, if you've read the comics and watched all the Marine Minutes, which I haven't, you'll have some more context for. But basically it starts off with Stingray having been damaged and out of action, and sets up the titular Project Orca, which is basically Stingray is potentially going to be decommissioned and replaced with a bigger Stingray-esque craft that has more missile tubes, more weapons, is painted black and white like an orca, and takes a crew of 7 people. And there's this kind of ongoing conflict between Troy and Phones and Captain Dune, who has been brought in to captain Project Orca. And needless to say, there is intrahuman conflict there. This novel, it's shorter. I think the Titanic Instruction was over 7 hours as an audiobook. This one's more like 4. But it manages to pack in a lot of adventure. There's some nice continuity. Following on from Lieutenant Coral having been introduced in the Titanic and Stratagem, she's back here, and she's now kind of part of the team. She's kind of we're rooting for her. And then we have the ongoing, how does this fit into the larger Titan plot? X20, what's going on? And there's some really interesting developments to Titan's surface agent network, of whom X20 is the one that we know and love from the TV show. I won't say any more about that. There is another of the scientists, and again, I should remember his name. I could pause to look it up, but I'm mid-flow, so I'm not going to look it up. His latest scheme, where a new land threat from the sea, which, how can I put this without spoiling it? There are echoes of the Cybermen from Doctor Who with a pleasingly Stingray twist. So, although when they first appear, you're like, these do feel quite like Cybermen. When you find out the truth, you're like, okay, no, that works within the context of Stingray. And each attack, they get further and further into the base, and there's peril, and that's very well done. And then there's the ongoing Project Orca stuff and Orca versus Stingray kind of stuff, which is all very, very good. Something happens, and I think if you're following, you'll think that one particular thing has happened, and then the writer kind of pulls the rug out from under your feet and goes, aha, you thought this was happening, but actually I've gone one step further. At least that was my experience, and I really, really appreciated that. And then it has a very satisfying climax that, again, finishes the novel, but leaves open. You're like, no, I want to find out what happens next. So it really has suckered me in and when gone, I really need to get hold of these comics because I want to see the fuller story of the Deadly Uprising and see how it resolves, because you are left hanging and going, no, there's ongoing storyline to be finished here. I want to find out what it is. So I thoroughly recommend these books. As I said, the cheapest way of getting a hold of them is $3.99 each on Amazon for the Kindle versions. You can, of course, get the signed hardback versions from the Anderson website, along with the comics, either if you want to kind of go the whole hog and buy the big comic collections, or just the Deadly Uprising one that's just been announced today. And do get over to the YouTube channel, because it is well worth watching the live performance from the concert, because it was a delight. It's as I said, it's much lighter in tone than the rest of the saga, but a suitable celebration of Stingray, I would say, complete with live music from the orchestra, and that's a key part of it. So I don't think there's much more to be said other than thank you, Michael, for getting me these review copies, and I look forward to appearing in your ears with something else very, very soon.